ahead and get started here. Thanks everyone for joining today. Let's see here. We can go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Dr. William Mosier. He is here to discuss student engagement in the classroom, and just a little bit of background about him. He is a professor of child development in the School of Health Sciences at Istanbul Galician University in Istanbul, Turkey, and is the director of the Linda A. Cohen Center for the Study of Child Development and Behavioral Health Clinic in Dayton, Ohio. Dr. Mosier is also a licensed independent marriage and family therapist and professor emeritus at the American College of Disability Analysts. He completed a doctorate in child development from the University of Southern California and completed the postgraduate training from the University of Nebraska College of Medicine. He is a diplomat in child psychology with the American Board of Psychological Specialties, American Board of Forensic Medicine, and the American Board of Disability Analysts. He is the author of 2 books, 50 peer-reviewed journal articles, and textbook chapters, and has presented over 100 seminars at international and national conferences. Dr. Mosier's prior professional experience includes teaching in the teacher corps in St. Louis, Missouri, and directing Head Start and Migrant Head Start of child development programs in California. He has served 20 years in the military, treating children on humanitarian and disaster relief missions throughout Latin America, Asia, and Africa as an international health specialist in Biomedical Science Corps. Yet, all of his responsibilities in life, Dr. Mosier identifies his most important roles as those of husband and father of 6 children. We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a minute, but if you have any questions at all throughout the webinar, feel free to chat those in through the Q&A box, and we will address those as they come in, and we'll save the rest for the end. But I'll go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Mosier.
Well, thank you very much. Today we're going to look at or address some strategies to enhance student engagement in an online learning setting. The leading question that's going to be addressed during these several slides is, how can you and I best support self-directed learning and collaborative engagement that leads to greater content mastery in an online environment? Well, some starting tips. Keep focus. The key focus must be self-directed learning. That is, helping students learn how to work independent from the instructor. Thus, ensure course design to allow that students find what they need and can succeed while working independently. It is crucial to make sure that your course design is facilitative of that process. The course syllabus is a critical resource for students. You need to have a clear schedule and stick to it. Have a clear grading rubric, including time limits and deadlines that students can easily access. Avoid overloading students with the amount of asynchronous assignments that you give, and ensure learners know how to get IT assistance if they're having problems with accessing your course online. So how do we best support student engagement? Spaced repetition rather than long lectures are much more palatable for students. The research is quite clear that about 20 minutes is a maximum length for a lecturette. Ensure students are connected with each other as well as with the course materials with online activities like accessing your learning management system to utilize breakout rooms, making sure that you give students plenty of breaks, and play a lot of learning games with the students, as well as asynchronously utilizing an opportunity for students to discuss the topics introduced in the course on what I refer to as a discussion board. Have supportive emotional interactions with your students so that when they get frustrated, they have someone they can turn to not feel so stressed out by having to deal with an online learning environment. Create exams and quizzes that minimize cheating behavior. I hate that term cheating, but the fact is that's why we have Turnitin as a plagiarism check. You want to minimize the risk of inappropriate behavior even entering the picture. Measure participation. Make sure that you have in the syllabus clear indication of how many points the project is worth, how many points discussion board participation is worth, attendance itself to the lectures, whether they attend at the time you're meeting or if they tune in and watch it afterward because you've pre-recorded. And the active engagement that they display with the material. One method I find very useful that works, that's well adapted for an online environment, that's often requiring students to do a lot of asynchronous learning, is case method approach. So I can use a 20-minute lecturette to give a brief clarification about a case. So in my courses like child development or the medically fragile child or psychopharmacology for children, I'll present a case and then facilitate the discussion of the case right there during a 1-hour course. And also have students either individually or in groups do presentations about their understanding and internalization of the case and the kinds of interventions that might be useful. What you want to do is build reflective tasks into each and every assignment. So students are thinking about their thoughts, thinking about how their thoughts will be communicated effectively, and they can reflect on how clearly they're able to communicate their ideas to others. So the bottom line is we want to humanize the experience of remote learning as much as possible. Encourage one-on-one instructor-learner engagement as well as engagement between the learners. So how do we do that? You want to build an active learning community by encouraging the learners to work together. You can certainly do that by having breakout rooms during your course time, synchronous course time, but then you can also build in a requirement for students to meet together on their own. Provide ongoing feedback during collaborative exercises that might occur during the recorded online portion of your course. You want to create an open forum, or what I refer to as discussion board, so that participation is a component of your grading system, which means you've got to make sure you have a clear rubric for participation in the open forum discussion board. You want to use a mixture of learning experiences to enhance engagement. Keep the lectures short, as I said before. Instead of a long lecture, you can often help students engage in learning about the topic by certainly having links to online resources, lecturettes that are given by other professionals, other professors that are recorded on YouTube. You want to assign a course project. At least I always assign a course project that's based on the student-identified problem or question or issue, concern, not something that I determine they need to learn. It's most important to keep the learning experience fun. We know very well that learning is caught and not taught. Subsequently, the more fun an activity is, the more engaged the person will be in accepting responsibility for their own learning. So you want to establish a sense of community by setting a tone of excitement for what's being learned. And you support the student feeling excited by you yourself being excited about the material. When the topic is child development, it's certainly hard for me not to be excited about the topic. You want to support students who are kind of apprehensive about participating by ensuring that the activities that you present are enjoyable, not just tedious, busy work. And one way to do that is by, while you're having the live session, have learning games that you put together with your students, for your students. You want to stop thinking that you need to control your students. Help them embrace self-directed learning. Stimulate active involvement by encouraging students to even interrupt your lecture and ask a question. Often, they have to post the question online rather than verbalize it. Either way, I encourage students to ask a question the minute they have a question, even if it's interrupting me mid-sentence. Why? Because the idea is to stimulate active engagement. And if a student has a question unanswered and then you move to a new topic, that might have deprived the student of an opportunity to help transfer learning from short-term to long-term memory. You certainly want to enhance learner engagement by encouraging learning contracts. Now, what I've done over the years is have learning contracts that are written agreements composed by the student. I have a model for them to use, but composed by the students that will provide the details of what the student is agreeing that they're going to learn, showing how that learning is going to be accomplished, and determining the evaluation criteria, in other words, the rubric for grading, to determine what grade they'll earn in the course. They often will contract for a grade, specific grade. So I'll have some students say, well, I just want a contract for a B, a guaranteed B. Then they put together a written agreement. With learning contracts, both instructor and the learner negotiate in writing the learning expectations and the evidence of the learning. Students can brainstorm ideas for their contract with their peers prior to negotiating a final contract with you. That can be done in distance learning setting via email or conference call. I find that nowadays with WhatsApp, it's very convenient for the students who have limited English writing skills to allow them to even conference call me or use my university email to ask a question about putting together their contract. The positives of learning contracts can't be overemphasized. Learning contracts can be a useful bridge to engage learners who have diverse learning needs. And that's very common in a college setting, as you well know, particularly in an online class when there might be 100 students in the class. Learning contracts can spark students' deeper involvement and commitment in the learning process rather than superficially saying, oh, I just want to pass this course. Students tend to experience confusion with the introduction of the idea of contracting for their grade. So you want to provide learning contract sample for students to use as a model that can help them put their contract together. Learning contracts can increase accountability and provide a specific plan for how the student is going to demonstrate how much learning has occurred. So the components of a learning contract are as follows. Students' needs in relation to learning objectives for the course should be identified. Specific learning resources that the student is committing him or herself to using. The assignments or the product that the child is going to, that the student is going to use to provide evidence for their learning of the objectives that they've set, completion dates, and the assessment criteria for grading their products and for assigning the final grade. So this sample learning contract is very general. You can Google learning contract samples online, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of examples that exist. But a basic format that I give the students is, by signing this learning contract, I commit to the following, and then they are to identify what they intend to learn, the activities they're going to do to accomplish that objective, and then how they're going to be evaluated based on the activities that they engage in. Now, you also want to make sure that you have a date determiner when they promise, when they commit to completing their contract. And then they sign and you sign and date it. Since learning is enhanced by playful activity, learning through play is something that we want to have as a major piece of the puzzle for helping to facilitate the learning of college students. Now, how I do it in my course is every third slide in my 20-minute lecture is a multiple choice question where I poll the students with an eye clicker approach, polling them to see how many think this A, B, C, or D is the right answer for the concepts that I've addressed in the two previous slides. You want to survey the learners to assess their understanding of the material. I do it halfway through the course. I ask students, how am I doing? And have them write down on an assessment form where they see themselves in terms of learning, mastering the content for the course, and what they see could be done to enhance their learning more. I use quiz questions to stimulate engagement. That is, multiple choice questions only to stimulate engagement, not to grade students. Another playful way to learn is encouraging students to do problem solving and sharing of ideas with their peers in small groups. This helps transfer learning from working memory to long-term memory. In my class, I use a lot of games to maintain interest, like Jeopardy or So You Want to Be a Millionaire type format. Include a course project as the opportunity for the student to pursue specific interests related to the course topics. Now, some students want to do it in a group, and some want to do it individually. I personally accept either way, just reminding students that I use Turnitin. Our university uses Turnitin technology to ensure that no two papers are going to be the same, so that individuals or groups of individuals have to make sure they're cautious to not plagiarize. How do we deal with class participation that will actually enhance student engagement? Well, I assign a lot of videos for students to watch before class, going to YouTube, and there'll be a link on my learning management system for them to go and watch a video prior to class, and then use the discussion board as a learning tool where then they discuss amongst themselves what they saw in the video even before we discuss it in class at the next live session. You can also use the discussion board as an asynchronous communication tool about course topics that you want to emphasize for the students. Most important, however, is nurturing self-paced, proactive, and self-directed learning, helping the learner be responsible for mastering the course content on their own. Help them understand that it's in their hands as the learner to accept responsibility for what they're going to learn. Ultimately, most effective learning is self-directed anyway and leads to greater motivation and greater retention of the material. How do you or I provide a sense of physical presence when we're in an online setting? Well, I do it by enhancing a sense of my presence by recording brief announcements to reduce that sense of isolation that students have. On our LMS, our learning management system, I can just press a button and record a message that then goes out to all the students. I can send short audio, short video messages to students to provide guidance for specific assignments, to answer questions that one student asks that I think many questions might share, many students might also have. It's helpful also to reiterate assignment criteria and deadlines with clear, concise expectations that maybe you announce with an audio or video message. You want to keep a balance of being an active facilitator of the learning process and an active participant in the learning process. Our job is to serve as a role model for active engagement in learning. Then comes the question, often asked, office hours or not office hours? It's a big question. I personally don't have office hours. I allow students to contact me through the course LMS system on their own when they have a question, or at the end of the week's live online session. What you want to do, though, is for sure make sure you establish criteria for when and how you can be contacted. You want to encourage independent and collaborative learning, both learning independently and learning as a group. Learners are more engaged when they receive regular exposure to the content that they're supposed to focus on. And we know from research that collaborative learning is more effective than competition for measuring understanding of course material. So I'm not an instructor who ever uses competition teams, one competing against the other. I see no merit in that. You can use collaborative learning activities such as group work, in-class games, breakout rooms, and the case studies that I mentioned before that can be discussed in small groups. Well, close to closing our session for today, we need to address, how am I going to assess students? How am I going to assess student learning so that I can assign a grade to each and every student? Well, the performance evaluation process, I find, needs to be flexible because there's such a diversity in the learners. To better support academic integrity and to improve learner writing skills, I always use short answer essay exams instead of multiple choice tests. I only use multiple choice questions for that every third slide question format that I used to reinforce what was on the two previous slides or slides earlier in the 20-minute segment. Have each learner accept responsibility for completing a course project is a very useful tool for having an assessment that is objective, that you can use a rubric to determine whether or not it meets the learning standards. So in conclusion, at least until there's a vaccination available, probably sometime in January, online learning is our new normal, which I would venture to say is not really normal. But while it can be challenging, online learning can still allow for a great exchange of ideas. Key to effective course management is having clear learning objectives with input from the students, and then addressing those learning objectives with engaging learning activities. Embrace self-directedness and collaborative learning, because that will lead to greater student engagement, greater student involvement, and enhanced mastery of the material. Keeping students engaged can be a struggle, no question about it. But incorporating these ideas can stimulate more active participation and greater content mastery. Well, here are some references that you will see later when you access this. Thanks for joining us today. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much. I have been keeping up with our Q&A, and we do have some questions for you. Some of them are related, and I'm going to start with the ones from the beginning and kind of work through the presentation in that manner.
Okay.
When you referenced giving breaks earlier, were you referring to giving them breaks while they're online, or do you encourage that in the classroom as well?
Well, since the average course at our university is 2 hours and 40 minutes, I certainly encourage students, whether it's online or in class, to take breaks. Now, being a theologian as well as a child development expert, why do you think a church homily, a sermon, is only 20 minutes? Well, at least in most traditional churches. That's because the research is unequivocal that the person's ability to pay attention is directly related to the seat of their pants, how much staying power they have for sitting and listening to something. So when I was referencing having a break scheduled in, I'm talking about breaks for that hour-long or 2-hour-long, however long your online course is, that the students are required to attend or watch later. And so I ensure that every 20 minutes we have a 10-minute pause. Yes, that means that I have to be very careful to ensure I include all the content material that needs to be covered in a semester, but then that's my responsibility and I embrace it fully.
Wonderful. And making those 20-minute increments really meaningful. Going off of that, a few participants were interested in some examples of the various learning games that you will utilize throughout the semester.
Yeah, over the years, I've had as a course project students to create So You Want to Be a Millionaire games and Jeopardy games, those type of games. And so I've utilized that format for like after a 20-minute period, start having one of those learning games, learning activities that I had mentioned before, so that it still is addressing the specific material in the course, yet in a way that's challenging to the students, but kind of fun because, oh, they see on the screen they're winning $10,000 for answering that question correctly, even though they're not really earning anything.
Wonderful. And a couple of questions came in while you were answering that question, wondering if you have any resources where you pull these games from.
No. Just creating them from, you know how publishers have the teacher reference material. I don't like that word teacher, but the professors have access to support materials like PowerPoints and a test question bank. So I go through those test question banks and I extract questions or create other questions that I think are more relevant, and then use those as the questions in the learning games. So yeah, that's the resource that I use most commonly, so that I'm not needing to reinvent the wheel, because all three of the major publishers offer you all of these questions that in multiple choice format or short answer format, or fill in the blank format, that can be used in your course, that you could never use all of them in one setting anyway. So I just take advantage of that and utilize those.
Wonderful. And a few questions came in regarding exams and cheating, and wondering if you could expand on how you create exams and what you do to minimize cheating.
For me, the major issue is that I've selected over the last 25 years is to not anymore use multiple choice tests as a way to assess understanding of the material, besides the fact that it's not an efficient way to assess learning anyway. But on top of the value of students providing short answers or short essays to answer 24 questions, that is kind of doing what we professors find as is the most frustrating piece of student learning. That is, students tend not to read the book. So if I have 20 questions or 24 questions that specifically have to be searched in the book to find the answer, and then have to be paraphrased in your own words so that Turnitin doesn't accuse the student of plagiarism. It doesn't even matter if 2 students or a half a dozen students work on creating the answers together, because all of my exams are take-home exams. So I give them plenty of time to search for the answer and then learn how to improve their English by paraphrasing what the textbook said about, or what my lecturette said about that particular topic.
There are a lot of questions coming in where participants are asking for examples of rubrics that you use, those midterm kind of student self-evaluations. If people would like examples of what you are using, how would you suggest they receive those?
Oh, well, they could certainly email me at either my personal email or my university email, and I'll respond. I also want to remind you that, see, like way back when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, all we had was IBM Selectric typewriters. We didn't even have computers yet. Well, I suppose the Department of Defense did, but not personal computers. And so word processing was just something that didn't exist. What now we have with being able to Google any question, I find that examples are just for rubrics are ad nauseum available online. And you just pick and choose the rubric that you want to modify to your specific situation, to the standards that you want to lead with. So one, I certainly am willing to share with people who email me, but two, there's also hundreds of rubrics that you can just Google and then pick and choose which one you're most interested in.
Wonderful. And going off of that, a couple of questions regarding what happens with those learning contracts, and if a student doesn't fulfill those learning contracts, are there practical outcomes that follow, or do you use it mainly as a tool to encourage best practice in the classroom?
Well, certainly best practice is very, very important. However, we all have an administration that puts pressure on us. And so I've learned through the years that a student who wanted an A, who was sure he or she deserved an A, but they only got a B, the rubric is your protection against them whining to the dean's office or the associate dean or whoever they complain to, or maybe even just to the department chair. So the value of that learning contract, from my perspective, is threefold. One, it protects me against that student who said, I've been an A student all my life through high school, undergraduate experience, and so I expect to get an A, but the quality of their work was not meeting the expectation for an A in the rubric. Then you're covered. Number two, I certainly want to nurture students feeling self-directed, in charge of their own learning. Subsequently, whatever project they want to use as a demonstration of the effectiveness of their learning, how well they've learned the material, can be a huge chunk of that learning contract. So what typically is in the learning contracts in my course, it's the student's performance, participation in the forum, the discussion board, the student's grade on the midterm and final essay exams, which are take home, and the student's demonstrated quality of understanding the material that they decided to choose as the topic for their project. So the typical learning contract is those three things, plus, of course, attendance. And you can decide for yourselves how much each one is worth. I typically do it as 10% for attendance, 30% for the project, 30% for the midterm and final, and 30% for their discussion board participation.
Wonderful.
And so the learning contract will be a way to objectify whether or not they accomplished those things they promised, they committed to.
Wonderful. And that actually, I think, pretty fully answers another question regarding how the learning contract is written when you have to take into account the syllabus and the grading criteria and guidelines, as well as how it's written to ensure that students have an understanding of the significance of those learning outcomes.
Well, that's why it's not just a document that is produced by the student, but facilitated by the instructor. So I have 50% input into how each learning contract is constructed. And it is so common, so common that a student will be told they've got to go back to the drawing board to come up with something that's a bit more substantial if the grade they're contracting for is an A. If they're only contracting for a C, then I'm more lenient on what they have agreed to based on the learning objectives of the course.
Wonderful. And I just want to confirm, you have a few more minutes to continue with questions, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful, because there are great questions in here that everyone is learning so much, so I don't want to cut any of these off. A lot of questions are coming in just about the management of the course. So for example, how you manage all of this in an online class, as well as just managing the variety of activities and assessments that you're utilizing throughout the semester.
Certainly a well thought out syllabus. And I realize we all, the syllabi for an accredited institution have to be approved by the institution. So we have to follow what's in the syllabus anyway, but within the parameters that are allowable, there is flexibility. And I encourage students to commit on their own to how they're going to accomplish and demonstrate their understanding of the material. Let's be realistic. The fact is that in any course, a person's only going to tend to remember 10% of what they've learned in a whole semester. So what is that 10% that I want them to understand? How big my nose is, whether or not they like the tone of my voice, whether or not they like my humor. Those things aren't as important. What I want them to learn are some specific concepts that are theoretically identified in the learning objectives that are already established in the syllabus, because that's what happens in accredited institutions. We have to have approved syllabi. So my concern is not how the student demonstrates that they understand that, for example, 50% of all human learning is etched in stone by the time you're language competent, somewhere around age 3-ish. I want them to understand why that's important in terms of language development, in terms of social emotional development, and cognitive development. So how they put the information together in order to demonstrate that they understand that conceptually, I leave that up to them. The key is how strong your rubric is for them demonstrating knowledge of the material. Think of the average licensing exam, like when I took the medical licensing board. Oh my goodness, there are questions that, yes, of course, there's a lot of questions that really are useful to know if you're going to be a general practitioner. But then there's a lot of questions that don't really help determine whether or not the person taking the test is going to become a competent healthcare professional. So over the years, I've just refined my approach to facilitating the learning process so that the student accepts responsibility for his or her own learning and then makes a commitment to it, which then can protect me against whining if the quality of their work wasn't worth an A, because they've written a contract saying, this is what I'll get to, if I want an A, this is what work I'll do if I want a B, etc.
And does any of that, what you just described from the expectations to the activities, does any of that change when you have either a large class size or when you move to online? Because a lot of participants are interested in how those two factors impact everything that you've described today.
Well, there's two things here that we're dealing with. Definitely, this is the hardest job you're ever going to love. But why on University of Southern California and University of Texas did once a big assessment of what people think are the most prestigious jobs in America. Physician was number 1, attorney was number 2, university professor was number 3. Well, it goes all the way down to garbage collector and panhandler as number 1. Well, it is a responsibility that we have as university professors to attempt to facilitate the learning process in a way that's palatable for students, in a way that's going to actually enhance students' understanding of the material. And that is no small task. And I get it. It's going to require a lot of, quote, extra time. Think about when I was a public school teacher 40 years ago. I took my work home on the weekends to prepare for my classes. Just because we get the more prestigious label of university professor, for me, that doesn't go away. When I was teaching in the classroom in the inner city in St. Louis, I made weekly home visits to each student's house. That's time consuming. Time that you're not paid for. But then one has to decide, what am I committing myself to in terms of this buzz phrase that I love so much, facilitating the learning process. If my interest is only in lecturing, that is throwing information out, and then whoever catches it, so be it, well, then that's one thing. That's one way to look at this job. But my way of looking at my responsibility as a facilitator of learning is to be more fully engaged than just for the the hours that I'm in the classroom with the student or in an online setting, when I'm interacting with the students online or looking at their work in an asynchronous circumstance. On top of that, I encourage the students to contact me, and I've learned through the years that, oh my goodness, that's why my ratings on the, at the end of the year, every accredited university has student evaluations. And that's why my student evaluations are always so high. Yes, out of 100 students, there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 who'll say, oh, I think Dr. Mosier was a butthead. But there'll be 97 who said, best course ever. Dr. Mosier really cared. And I wasn't even trying to care. I was just attempting to be responsive to people emotionally and socially, attempting to facilitate their learning process. I think it's a question of understanding one's place in the universe in relationship to everyone else. And since I get it that you're, everybody who's listening right now, you're my transpersonal self, the degree to which I'm capable of even understanding anything I see in you or hear you say is the degree to which I can understand myself. That's very humbling. And so I don't mind. I just don't mind answering students' questions, going that, quote, extra mile, as it were, because I don't think about it as going an extra mile. Sorry for the long-winded answer, Megan.
No, it was wonderful. And there are still some questions in here, so we're going to take 1 or 2 more. And one that I think is important to touch on is in regards to your use of case studies in the classroom, where you said that you have students discuss those and then talk about those. Participants are wondering where you legally find these case studies and how you really get students discussing them collaboratively and making it a meaningful part of your course.
Oh, wow. So many textbooks have built-in case studies. So there are so many case studies online available. And frankly, so many case studies from my own educational experience that I've just kept over the years that I use and reuse and reuse and reuse. They're always relevant. And then with my current patient population, I'm always having a family that presents an interesting case for analysis. And you can introduce that without talking about names or family identifiers to respect the privacy of a family. Let's just take a classic example in my field of bedwetting. So if a family comes to me and says, oh my goodness, my kid is now 4 years old and he's still bedwetting, and then present a case to the students about that. And then we talked about sphincter control and we addressed the issue of antidiuretic hormone and when that kicks in the hypothalamus. That provides some information for students to then start discussing the issue and address a lot of myths that people have about the topic, in this particular case, primary nocturnal enuresis, bedwetting. And then what kind of interventions won't scar a child cognitively, socially, or emotionally? And then how do you support the family in that? So there are just a wealth on Google of case studies available, as well as case studies in the textbooks that we utilize, as well as case studies in the former textbooks that I use that I still refer to, and then ones from my own education that have just weathered time very well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mosier. It looks like we're right at time here. So just as a reminder, everyone will be getting a copy of the slideshow that he shared with us today, as well as the recording to today's webinar. And any outstanding questions, we here will do our best to reach out and get those answered for you following up today. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Mosier. This was a great webinar. We had tons of questions able to be answered live, and we really appreciate everything today that you shared in your presentation.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's my honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a safe and happy weekend, and we will get in touch shortly with that recording.